Hey, what's up guys? Today we're going to talk about Gaming, a 4-star pyro carry that was released in version 4.4. Gaming is a plunge-focused pyro character who mainly deals his damage through using his elemental skill, launching himself up in the air, and then plunging and triggering reactions. And because of that, we're going to talk about Gaming, how good he is, and also how to build him, covering everything you need to know about Gaming, his best weapons, teams, artifacts, constellations, and much more. But before we begin, however, I want you guys to know that I do stream most nights on Twitch, link in the description. With that being said, let's get right into it. Now starting off, what does Gaming actually do? His elemental skill, Bestial Ascent, allows him to pounce forward using the Wushu arts, leaping high into the air after coming into contact with a target or surface. After Gaming has used Bestial Ascent to rise into the air, if he immediately uses a plunging attack, he will use the especially powerful plunging attack, Charmed Cloud Strider, instead. When he triggers the plunging attack Charmed Cloud Strider, the damage from plunging attacks caused by Bestial Ascent is converted to pyro damage that cannot be overridden by other elemental infusions. Upon landing, Gaming consumes a fixed amount of HP. Gaming's HP cannot be reduced below 10% by this method. And this plunge attack is obviously considered plunging attack damage. Now this enhanced plunge attack of Charmed Cloud Strider has a higher multiplier than the default plunge attack does. At the same talent level, it's a decent amount higher, however, there is no collision plunge. In other words, you can't be hitting enemies on the way down with your plunge attack like you can with a normal plunge attack. This means the total multiplier, assuming the same talent level, is actually slightly lower on the enhanced plunge attack from the skill than from a default plunge attack. However, because all of that damage is dealt in one instance, it means you can react all of it rather than only a portion of it, and on top of that, Gaming's Constellations increase his skill talent level, but they don't increase his normal attack talent level. This means his Charmed Cloud Strider special plunge attack will generally be doing a fairly reasonable amount more damage than a default plunge attack. The HP consumption from the elemental skill doesn't tend to matter too much to Gaming because he tends to be played with support units that heal him a decent amount. His skill cooldown is 6 seconds, however, his burst is going to allow him to use his skill much more often than once every 6 seconds. So, what does his burst do? Swanni's Gilded Dance. Gaming enters Wushu's stance, briefly applying pyro to him, recovering a fixed amount of HP, and summons his companion, the Swanni Manchai, to smash into his target, dealing AoE pyro damage. After bashing its target, Manchai will roll to a nearby location before moving towards Gaming. When it links up with Gaming, Manchai will leave the field and reset the cooldown for Gaming's elemental skill, Bestial Ascent. While Wushu's stance is active, his resistance to interruption is increased, and when Gaming lands with Charmed Cloud Strider attacks or completes the forward pounce attack from Bestial Ascent with over 50% HP, he will summon Manchai again. Each Gaming can only have one Manchai on the field simultaneously. This effect will be cancelled once Gaming leaves the field. In other words, Gaming summons his little friend Manchai, which allows him to reset his skill cooldown whenever he catches him. On top of that, his burst puts him in a stance where using his plunge attacks will summon Manchai again. Including the skill animation time and the Manchai travel time, this effectively allows you to use your skill around once every 2 seconds during his burst duration. We are going to be getting into ways that Gaming has to either speed up or slow down his skills in a later portion of this video. His burst costs 60 energy on a 15-second cooldown, and his skill generates 2 particles with an internal cooldown on how often the particles can be generated. Generally, in practice, this leads to his skill generating 2 particles around once every other plunge. When Manchai is generated from using his burst or using a plunge attack during his burst, the direction it will roll into is randomized. There are some limitations on the direction in which Manchai can be thrown, mainly that it won't get thrown into directions where there's a wall, but there is a certain amount of RNG involved. Because of that, there can be some inconsistency in terms of how quickly you can get your skill. In most scenarios, you can expect somewhere between 6 and 9 plunge attacks during his burst. Gaming doesn't have internal cooldown on either his skill or his burst, which does mean that he's able to react, whether it be melt or vape, every single high damage hit that he does. His Ascension 1 passive, Dance of Amity, says, after Bestial Ascent's plunging attack, Charmed Cloud Strider hits an opponent, Gaming will regain 1.5% of his max HP once every 0.2 seconds for 0.8 seconds. In other words, he restores about 6% of his HP every plunge attack, after consuming 15% from that plunge attack. Its second Ascension passive, that he unlocks at Ascension 4, Air of Prosperity. When Gaming has less than 50% HP, he will receive a 20% incoming healing bonus. This should never happen. Obviously, if you do get hit, it happens. that's okay. But assuming you're playing him in his good teams, you should have enough healing that you will not be staying under 50% HP for a long period of time. When Gaming has 50% HP or more, however, his plunge attack, Charmed Cloud Strider, will deal 20% more damage. Now, let's talk about how you're supposed to play Gaming. There are two main ways to play Gaming. Both of them rely heavily on triggering reactions with all of his attacks. If all you do is wait until your Manchai comes back and use your skill whenever it does, you will generally be getting 6 elemental skills before your Manchai stops getting generated. However, there are ways to increase this amount of elemental skills. The first and most basic way of doing that is to simply run towards Manchai whenever it spawns. If that's what you do, you should be able to get around 7 on average. And the second way of increasing the amount of elemental skills Gaming can get is to juggle using his Manchai. So what do I mean by juggling? Well, Manchai gets generated when you complete your plunge attack. However, if there's already a Manchai on the field, because of Gaming's 1 Manchai limit on the field simultaneously, the plunge attack will not generate a Manchai. What that means is that if you start your rotation with a burst and do a skill, and you do your skill immediately, the first plunge attack will hit the enemy before you catch the Manchai that is generated by the burst. If you do that, that plunge attack will not spawn Manchai, and you will only start spawning an additional Manchai after your second plunge attack. However, if you delay your first elemental skill a little bit and try to catch your Manchai while you're in the air after using your elemental skill, but before using your plunge attack, you'll be able to spawn Manchai from that first plunge attack. And as long as you keep doing that over and over, you'll effectively be layering the amount of time that it takes for Manchai to roll away and then fly back towards you with your own plunge attack animation. Using this trick, you'll be able to generally get around 9 elemental skills rather than 7. However, that's not the only way you can increase the amount of plunges you're doing. If you're using him with Qianyun on your team, you can also just do a normal plunge attack by jumping and then plunging. That plunge attack, however, will do less damage, so you should only be using it in certain scenarios. Now, which combo you're going to want to use is going to depend on the team you're using, which brings me to my next point: how good is Gaming in all of his different teams? Gaming is a character whose performance varies wildly, depending on the scenario and the team. The biggest problem that Gaming can encounter is energy problems. Because Gaming is a burst-reliant character with burst-reliant supports, and because his particle generation, rather than happening at the start of his rotation, like is the case for many other characters, happens throughout his rotation depending on the amount of plunges that he does, if the enemies die early, his energy generation falls off by quite a bit. Because of that, in a lot of his teams, he ends up struggling to get his burst back throughout multiple chambers. His ER requirements, assuming your rotations go all the way through without any hiccups, are relatively low, but higher ER is going to make him much more comfortable to play. So, what are his ER requirements? In the best case scenario, when he gets a good amount of plunges and is used with supports that generate a good amount of off-field particles, especially ones that can use Favonius weapons, his ER requirements can be as low as 110 or even 100% ER. However, if anything goes wrong, or if things go too well and you kill the enemies too quickly, his ER requirements can go up. I generally recommend building around 140 or a little bit higher energy recharge on him for his clears to be comfortable. But even with around 140 ER, you'll have to make sure you don't kill the enemies too quickly into your rotation, and if the enemy's HP starts getting pretty low, you might want to swap out and make sure you generate particles before the end of the chamber. Alright, now with that out of the way, let's talk about how to build Gaming. First, we can talk about the artifact sets. His general best artifact set is going to be the Crimson Witch of Flames. He can also be used on Maréchaussée Hunter, he can be used on Gilded Dreams, and he can be used on Vermilion Hereafter. Pretty much all of these artifact sets have some upsides and some downsides. Let's start with Crimson Witch. Crimson Witch 2-piece increases your pyro damage by 15%, and the 4-piece increases your reaction damage on Vape and Melt by 15%, but also, using an elemental skill increases the amount of pyro damage you get from the 2-piece by 50% of its starting value for 10 seconds, up to 3 stacks. In other words, you get a stacking pyro damage buff of 7.5% every time you use your skill. Now obviously, Gaming is a character who does a lot of damage by using his skill, but he does a good amount of his damage before having used his skill 3 times, which means that his uptime on Crimson Witch of Flames won't necessarily be the best. That being said, the reaction damage bonus is actually very valuable. The reaction damage increase from the 4-piece is actually added onto the Elemental Mastery multiplier. The number you can see if you click on the little question mark here next to your Elemental Mastery. It tells you increases damage dealt by Vaporize and Melt by 46.6% at 282 Elemental Mastery. This 15% increased reaction damage is added onto this, and it goes to 61. Because you tend to have less reaction damage bonus than you have damage percent at 282 EM, I have as much reaction damage bonus as I get from a goblet, but I have more sources of damage percent than just a goblet, then that makes this 15% reaction damage much more valuable than 15% damage percent. Despite Gaming doing a good portion of his damage before he gets all of his Crimson Witch stacks, his first plunge attack will still have 1 stack, his second will have 2, and his third onwards will have 3. You can think of the Crimson Witch 4-piece bonus as just a lot more EM on top of the damage percent. The reason why Crimson Witch tends to be his best in slot artifact set is because he also has some minor anti-synergy with the other artifact sets. So his other viable artifact sets, like I said, include Marie-José Hunter. So what's the problem with Marie-José Hunter? Well, he does decrease and increase his current HP, but he doesn't do it until after his first plunge attack. And that means that both his burst and his first plunge attack will not have any buffs from Marie-José Hunter, because you don't get any value from the 2-piece bonus, which doesn't buff burst or plunge damage, and you don't get any value from the 4-piece until after your first plunge. Crimson Witch, on the other hand, gives you 15% damage bonus and 15% reaction damage on your burst, and then an additional 7.5% damage on your first plunge. Now, if you're using Farina on your team and you have a way of stacking Marie-José Hunter before doing some of your damage, it does make Marie-José Hunter better, but it is never going to be significantly ahead of Crimson Witch, and it's only usable in some of his teams. All of that being said though, the difference in damage between a good Crimson Witch set and a good Marie-José set doesn't tend to be all that large. Which means if you have a very strong Marie-José already, it may not be worthwhile to go out of your way to get yourself a new Crimson Witch set. And the same would be true if the sets were reversed. Other viable sets that you can use include Gilded Dreams, which gives you 180 Elemental Mastery and 14% attack, but 100 of that Elemental Mastery and that 14% attack also don't apply to the burst, so it's not perfect synergy. And then on top of that, the total amount of value that you get from it is not quite as high as what you get from other sets. And finally, Vermilion, where your biggest issue with Vermilion is the fact that all you get from it is a lot of attack. And in a lot of Gaming's teams, attack becomes very redundant. Not only can he have the ability to stack a lot of attack himself, but he also has great synergy with supports that make pretty much every other stat outside of attack stronger without affecting the value of attack. Because of that, while Vermilion is a viable artifact set, it will not tend to be his best one. Next, we can talk about the stats that you should be looking for on all of those artifacts. Gaming is a carry character who doesn't have an anti-crit passive, which means that crit rate and crit damage are going to be very valuable on him. Outside of that, he's an attack scaler and a reaction-based carry, which means that attack percent and elemental mastery will also be quite good. And as I mentioned earlier, his energy requirements tend to be non-trivial, meaning that getting enough energy recharge to be able to play comfortably will also be something that is quite important. Because of that, the stats you're looking for are going to be crit rate, crit damage, EM, attack percent, and energy recharge. What about your main stats? Well, on the circlet, you're obviously going to want crit. Because Gaming has access to quite a lot of sources of external crit rate through, as we're going to talk about later, his Constellation 6, but also potentially through the use of Xian Yun, which gives plunge attack crit rate, through the use of Marie-José Hunter, which gives 36% crit rate, and through a lot of his good weapons being crit rate weapons, I would generally recommend going for a crit damage circlet over a crit rate one, although if your specific build allows for you to go for a crit rate circlet without reaching over 100% crit rate, then there is no problem with that. For the goblet, you're going to want a pyro damage goblet, but for the sands, you have a few options. In most of Gaming's best teams, he's played alongside Xiangyun. Because Xiangyun adds damage to Gaming's plunge attacks based on her own attack rather than Gaming's attack, it effectively means that that portion of the plunge attack damage is completely unaffected by an attack sense. However, it can still react, and if it does react, an EM sense will increase the amount of damage that Xiangyun is providing. In other words, an attack sense will only affect a portion of Gaming's plunge damage, whereas an EM sense will affect all of it. Because of that, in those Gaming teams, you will much rather have an Elemental Mastery sense over an attack one. However, Gaming has a decent amount of viable teams that do not use Xiangyun, and if you are not using her, then the value of EM Sands goes down, or rather, attack Sands become comparatively much closer. Technically, you can also use an ER Sands if you have no ER whatsoever on the rest of your artifacts and you find yourself struggling with energy, but I would generally not recommend it. As a reminder, I would recommend aiming for around 140 ER for comfortable gameplay, but as long as you have at least 120, you should be fine. Next up, let's talk about Gaming's best weapons. Gaming is actually one of the few characters whose best in slot weapon isn't actually a 5-star one. Here, I'm not talking about R5 5-star weapons, but if you're looking at R5 4-star weapons and R1 5-star weapons, his best weapon is actually relatively often a 4-star one. And that's just because Serpent Spine is, well, really good. As I mentioned earlier, Gaming is a character who has great synergy with Xiangyun, and as such, his synergy with weapons that provide him with more attack tends to be a little bit weaker. This means that the lower base attack from 4-star weapons is less of a downside on him than it is on most characters. His best weapon option tends to be a high refinement Serpent Spine or the new Fruitful Hook plunge-focused weapon. Now, a quick glance at the stats provided by the Fruitful Hook may lead you to believe that the Fruitful Hook is a better weapon for him than Serpent Spine. It does provide, at R5, 32% crit rate, which is more crit than Serpent Spine, 32% plunge attack damage, which is more damage percent than Serpent Spine, it has higher base attack, and it gives attack percent. That's just a lot more of everything, right? Well, the trigger condition for Fruitful Hook is hitting an opponent with a plunge attack. That means that the first plunge attack isn't buffed. Similarly, it only provides plunge, crit rate, and damage percent, which means that the burst also isn't buffed. Serpent Spine, on the other hand, starts with all of its buffs, assuming you have it pre-stacked. Because of that, a fully stacked Serpent Spine versus Fruitful Hook, they both generally tend to perform relatively similarly. But Fruitful Hook has the upside of not increasing incoming damage and not requiring you to wait to pre-stack it. With all of that being said though, Fruitful Hook is a weapon banner exclusive 4-star weapon, and most people tend to not have a lot of refinements on those. Low refine Fruitful Hook, compared to high refine, is actually not much better than the other 4-star options, because so much of the value from Fruitful Hook is from the effect rather than the stat line. That means that if you don't have Fruitful Hook, which is going to be the case for most people, the 5-star weapons that provide a good amount of stats will tend to be his best options. The most important factor when it comes to choosing your weapon from Gaming is making sure that you don't overcap on crit. While weapons like Beacon of the Reed Sea are quite strong on him, the fact that they provide crit rate can end up limiting your options, and you have to be careful not to overcap if you're using them. You're gonna have to make sure you do the same thing if you're using Serpent Spine, Fruitful Hook, or any other crit rate claymore. Outside of those 4-star weapons, which have some issues, Fruitful Hook being that it's a gacha weapon banner exclusive weapon, and that it's only good at high refine, and Serpent Spine requiring you to pre-stack it for it to be competitive, what are his best weapons? Malika's signature, 1,000 Blazing Suns, will tend to be his best 5-star weapon option. Beacon of the Reed Sea, Redhorn, Stone Thresher, and Verdict are all very close to one another, a little bit below 1,000 Blazing Suns. And finally, Fang of the Mountain King, Wolf's Gravestone, and Unforged are all close enough to the 4-star weapons that they're not worth going for if you have his 4-star options. In order to truly understand each weapon's value in Gaming, you need to realize that the damage that comes from his plunge attack after using his skill is not skill damage. His skill actually doesn't hit enemies at all. That means that Beacon of the Reed Sea doesn't have access to one of its stacks, the one that's reliant on your character's elemental skill hitting an opponent. And it also means that a weapon like Earthshaker that provides skill damage bonus doesn't actually do anything for him. Mailed Flower, on the other hand, while it does have a trigger condition of using an elemental skill, that's only one of the 2 potential trigger conditions. You get the Mailed Flower buff after a character's elemental skill hits an opponent, or after the character triggers an elemental reaction, and Gaming will, hopefully, always be triggering elemental reactions. This means that Mailed Flower's passive will not buff the first hit that he does, the one that triggers the first reaction, in most cases that being his burst, but it will buff every single plunge attack afterwards. And that's why Mailed Flower tends to be his best free-to-play option. Now, if you weren't playing while Mailed Flower was around and you didn't get it, you can use Rain Slasher in teams where you're using Vape instead of Melt. But outside of that, Gaming doesn't tend to have the best weapon options. His best craftable option will tend to be Tidal Shadow, but because all that Tidal Shadow provides is a lot of attack, it doesn't tend to perform all that well in the teams that use Xianyan. For people who want to build a strong Gaming, don't have a Battle Pass weapon or a 5-star weapon to use on him, and missed the Mailed Flower event, Gaming is actually one of the very few characters where I think it can be reasonable to use a Blackcliff weapon. Even with 0 stacks, Blackcliff tends to be fairly competitive with Tidal Shadow, and obviously, Blackcliff does quite a bit better if you do get stacks on it. On top of that, Blackcliff visually suits him incredibly well. With all of that being said, Tidal Shadow is still not that far behind Mailed Flower, and if that's the weapon you're using, there isn't that much of a problem with that. Next up, let's talk about Gaming's Constellations, because Gaming is a fairly Constellation-reliant character. It's Constellation 1, Bringer of Blessings. When the Swanee Mantai from Swanee's Gilded Dance meets back up with Gaming, it will heal 15% of Gaming's HP. This effectively means that during his burst, he's actually HP positive rather than HP negative. But this doesn't really matter too much because in most situations, you should be playing Gaming with another healer. Not because you need the healing, but because his best supports actually have healing in their kit. Constellation 2, Plum Blossoms Underfoot. When Gaming receives healing and this instance of healing overflows, his attack will be increased by 20% for 5 seconds. Because his burst heals him for 30%, this will generally happen as soon as you use your burst at the start of your rotation, and you should be able to maintain a decent amount of uptime on this, especially with that C1. That means it's a 20% attack increase, which is pretty solid. Next up, his Constellation 3 increases the level of his skill by 3. This is actually his most relevant constellation before C6, because increasing the level of his skill by 3, considering the fact that his skill is the large majority of his damage, is actually a fairly sizable damage increase. Next is his Constellation 4. Now, when I've talked about his energy requirements earlier, I was talking about Gaming with Constellation 4 or higher. His AR requirements without this constellation tend to be much higher, but with it, they're fairly reasonable. Next up, his Constellation 5 increases his burst talent level, which is actually significant, because while your burst isn't anywhere close to the large majority of your damage that your skill is doing, your burst will generally happen at the start of your rotation, which is when you have the most of your buffs. A lot of his teams have buffs that expire in the middle of your rotation, and the burst will have most of those. And because of that, the levels on the burst do matter. And finally, his Constellation 6 increases the Charm Cloud Rider's crit rate by 20% and crit damage by 40%, which is 80 crit value. And then on top of that, it also pretty significantly increases the attack radius. Now, without this constellation, Gaming's AoE is incredibly small, and he tends to be a pretty bad unit in AoE scenarios. With it, he's a lot stronger in AoE scenarios. On top of that, he's also a lot stronger as a whole, because 20% crit rate and 40% crit damage, that's more crit value than you get from a main stat. It's a lot of crit. Gaming is one of the 4-star carries who's the most reliant on his constellations. He's up there with characters like Xiangling in terms of how constellation reliant they are. But unlike Xiangling, he's not nearly as old, he's not available in the Paimon's Bargain rotating shop, you don't get one for free, and his big significant constellation is the C6, not the C4. This means that it's a lot harder to get yourself a Gaming in a strong state. Now, C0 Gaming is still strong enough to be playable, but he doesn't really compete with other carries without his constellations. Now, with that out of the way, let's talk about Gaming's best teams. Now, it's important to emphasize just how reaction-reliant Gaming is. If Gaming doesn't trigger any reactions, he's honestly not a particularly strong character. Because of that, when it comes to Gaming's strong teams, I wouldn't recommend using either Mono Pyro or Chevaleur's teams. He is going to be significantly stronger in Meld and Vape teams. Now, Gaming is a character who doesn't actually use normal attacks as a default part of his rotations. He can potentially use them, but he doesn't use them by default. Because of that, he doesn't tend to have the best synergy with Yelan and Xingqiu. On top of that, his elemental application, when compared to the elemental application of other reaction carries like Hu Tao, is quite a bit slower. This means he's not nearly as reliant on fast application, and it means he has better synergy with characters like Farina. When it comes to Gaming's Vape teams, I would generally not try to play them without Farina. If you don't have Farina available to you, I would generally recommend Meld. Now, does that mean that I think Farina is better than the Meld teams? Well, no, and we'll talk about that more when we talk about the Meld teams. But first, let's talk about these Farina teams. Now, Farina is enough Hydro for Gaming to be able to vape all of his vapeable hits. However, there can be situations where that's not the case anymore. Obviously, Farina is a character that's reliant on you having a healer, which means that you're really going to want to be using either at least Xianyun or Bennett. You can also be using Xilonen if you want as another viable option. Now, when it comes to the last teammate slot in these teams, the one that will offer you the highest ceiling for damage is going to be Bennett. However, these teams tend to be a decent amount harder to play with relatively inconsistent setups. On top of that, they don't tend to do all that well in multi-wave scenarios. For those reasons, the Vape teams that I tend to prefer playing with Gaming are the ones that use 2 Hydro units, where you focus on using normal attacks to proc your Yelan or Xingqiu coordinated attacks while waiting for your Mantai to come back. The biggest potential issue in a team like this is that Xianyun's Elemental Burst applies Anemo to enemies that get hit by your plunge attacks. Now, when you're in AoE, that's not a problem, but in single target, you apply Anemo after having applied Pyro onto your Hydro Aura. That's going to be enough to remove the aura, which means that if you do your next plunge attack before Farina applies Pyro again, you will lose your reaction. And that can be a problem in these teams. And that's part of the reason why I tend to like using that second Hydro unit, effectively making sure that your application is more consistent. These teams obviously will have much lower personal damage coming from Gaming, because a lot more of the team's damage is going to be coming from Farina and Yelan's personal damage. Outside of those Vape teams though, you can also play Melt teams. And Gaming actually has access to what is arguably the highest ceiling for speedrunning when it comes to 4-star only teams. A very well built Gaming on this 4-star only double cryo team is actually one of the best 4-star only speedrunning teams. However, you're playing multiple characters that limit you to a relatively small circle. With all of that being said though, it is still a fairly strong Gaming team. However, if you're using Rosaria, that's even more crit rate that you get. And if you're using Cryo Resonance, that's even more crit rate that you get. And that's an additional source of crit rate that can lead to you overcapping crit on your stats. Now, the best Gaming Melt team used to be either this one or maybe this one, which offered higher damage but less consistency. But that was before they released Citlali. And boy, is Citlali a great support for Gaming. Citlali significantly improved the Melt teams for him, giving them much higher damage ceilings, and just making them overall quite a bit stronger. Gaming's best Melt teams are pretty much all Gaming, Bennett, Citlali +1. Now, if you don't have Citlali, you can use Rosaria as a unit that applies a similar amount of cryo at its similar intervals, but obviously, Rosaria doesn't provide as much to the team as Citlali does. What are your options for that last slot? Well, the strongest one will generally be Xianyun, but Xianyun is far from necessary in this team. You can use Xilonen, you can use Sucrose, you can use Kazuha, you can use a second cryo unit like Rosaria or Iona, Or you can even use a unit like Kea if you just want much more consistent melts because his crime application is faster, but you end up with a decent amount of options on this slot. One thing to be careful about is the idea of playing Citlali with Farina. When you apply Pyro onto a frozen enemy, it will trigger Melt. However, if that Pyro attack is a blunt attack, like is the case for Gaming's attacks because he's a Claymore user, and plunge attacks are blunt, it will actually shatter instead of triggering Melt. Now, if the enemy also has an underlying aura, that won't be a problem, and you'll at least get either Vape if the underlying aura is Hydro, or Melt if the underlying aura is Cryo. But when you're using Citlali plus Farina, because neither of them has particularly fast application, in most situations, you won't have an underlying aura, and you'll effectively be losing out on most of your damage. Now, because not everyone has Citlali or Farina, and because his reaction teams are quite a bit worse if you don't have either of them, whether it be just because their damage is lower, or because they're just a lot more difficult to play because of the Circle impact from characters like Rosaria, we can still quickly mention the non-reaction teams. He can still be played with characters like Xianling in Monopyro, or like Fischl in Evre's teams. And your overall team's DPS will be significantly lower than the reaction teams, but it won't necessarily be too bad. And so, overall, Gaming is a 4-star character who doesn't really have the best versatility, whether it be in his team building or his situational versatility. He tends to have a lot of different enemies that make him feel a lot worse. However, when everything goes right, Gaming definitely is one of the strongest carries in the game. You really want to have his Constellations, and ideally, you really want to have the supports that are good with him, but if you do, Gaming actually is a fairly strong carry. If you already have an unbuilt Gaming, especially if you have a C5 Gaing going into the Lantern Rite 4-star selection event, he may be worth picking up. Anyways, I hope this guide was helpful, thanks so much for watching, and as always, I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.